Hello Flight Simmers and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. This is lesson 14 in our VFR or Private Pilot Training series. In this video, we'll take a look at the special procedures you need to use when taking off and landing on soft surfaces such as grass and dirt. So far in our training, we've been taking off and landing on paved runways. But many runways in both Flight Sim and the real world are not paved, including many that are featured in game events like the bush trips and landing challenges. And in Flight Sim, pretty much any relatively flat, open, and fairly level area of adequate length can be used as a takeoff or landing site. Non-paved runways, also sometimes called unimproved surfaces, are runways that use some sort of natural surface rather than being paved with asphalt or concrete. In the real world, they can be made of just about any material that you can find on the surface of the earth, including grass, dirt, sand, gravel, and even rock or ice. But the only surface types that are emulated in Flight Simulator are grass, dirt, and ice. Ice runways can be treated pretty much like very slick, hard-surfaced runways. Other than being aware that you won't have great braking action on these runways, you don't need any special techniques to land on them. Soft field procedures should be used anytime the runway is made from a soft or loose surface, such as grass, dirt, gravel, or sand. Again, only grass and dirt fields will be emulated in Flight Simulator, though airports that are made of other types of material, like gravel, may be included in Flight Simulator, but they will typically be depicted as either dirt or grass runways. Aircraft performance is affected by soft fields. The soft surface decreases aircraft acceleration and reduces aircraft braking ability, which in turn increases both your takeoff and landing distances. Using soft field procedures allows us to minimize this impact, but we still need to make some corrections to our takeoff and landing data. So if we take a look at the takeoff performance chart for the 152, it tells us in note number 4 here that for operation on a dry grass runway, we need to increase the distances by 15% of the ground roll figure. So we are going to assume that we are at max gross weight, that we're operating at sea level, and that we're operating at 25 degrees C. This is the temperature. We'll just round up and go with the 30 degrees C number like we did in our short field video. So our ground roll on a paved runway is going to be 810 feet, and our total to clear a 50-foot obstacle is going to be 1,495 feet, again on a paved runway. So let's look at what that's going to do if we take off from a dry grass runway. So again, we've got 810 feet of total ground roll on a paved runway. We need to multiply that times 15% or 0.15, and that means we're going to get an extra 122 feet of ground roll if we're taking off from a dry grass runway. So 810 plus 122 equals a total ground roll of 932 feet on a dry grass runway. So still pretty good performance, but we're getting close to needing 1,000 feet to get off the ground if we're operating off a grass runway. And looking at the distance to clear a 50-foot obstacle, again, normally on a paved runway, it's going to be 1,495 feet from the time our tires start rolling until we get enough altitude achieved to clear that obstacle. So we need to, again, to add that 122 feet from the ground roll onto that total distance. So 1,495 plus 122 feet equals a total distance of 1,617 feet to clear that 50-foot obstacle. And you only expand the ground roll portion or add that ground roll factor because the grass is going to be slowing you down as you're rolling on the grass, but once you get airborne, it's no longer slowing you down. So you don't need to add anything extra to the air distance that you need to get that 50-foot height. So if we take a look at the landing distance table, we take a look at the note down here. It says for operation on a dry grass runway, increase your distances by 45% of the ground roll figure. So a little bit more than we were having to correct for taking off. So again, we'll assume we're at max gross weight. We'll assume we are at sea level. We'll assume we're 25 degrees C, but we'll round up to 30 degrees C. And if we were operating on a dry paved runway, it's going to be 500 feet of ground roll and it's going to be 1,240 feet to get airborne and clear a 50-foot obstacle. So how does that work out on a grass runway? So again, our ground roll is going to be 500 feet on a paved runway. We multiply that by 45% and get an extra 225 feet that we need to add to the ground roll. So the ground roll on the grass runway is going to be 725 feet. And our distance to clear a 50-foot obstacle is normally 1240 on a paved runway. Again, we need to add that 225 feet that we got in the last step to that 1240, and we come up with a distance of 1,465 feet to clear a 50-foot obstacle if we're operating on a dry grass runway. So close to 1,500 feet is what we're going to need if we're taking off from a grass runway. So finding a short field to practice with in Flight Simulator is pretty easy. Go to the world map and then click More, and then go to Open Filters. I'm going to center up the map here first. So Open Filters, and then I usually set the background map to IFR because it's easier to see the dots when I'm looking for airports. And then I'm going to go down to the bottom, and I'm going to make sure that airspace, nav aids, and fix and position reports are off. I am going to, there we go. Points of interest, I'm going to turn landmarks off, and I'm going to turn fauna off, but I'll keep the CDs on so I can see what I'm close to. And then we'll go up to airports, runways. We'll leave airports on, but we'll turn everything else off except for grass runways and dirt runways. And then whatever we have left is now either a grass runway or a dirt runway. And you can filter for the individual types you want. If you just want to see the grass runways, turn the dirt runways off. And then anything that's left on the map now will be a grass field. So we'll zoom in here to 78 Mike 0 or Mike Oscar, and we can see that this is a airport. I believe this is out in Missouri. That has 1,819 feet of grass. So again, this is a good way to search for airports that you would like to use if you want to get some practice at either a grass strip or a dirt strip. So one of the biggest challenges in flying in and out of airports with no paved runways is finding the airport in the first place, since there's no pavement to help it stand out from the surrounding fields and terrain, and most of the time, unpaved runways are also not lighted. And this is true to real life. It's often difficult to spot unpaved runways in the real world as well. While some unpaved runways are marked in some way and some stand out from the surrounding terrain or the surrounding area, many aren't or don't. But here are a few things you can look for in Flight Simulator to help you find unpaved runways. So one of your hints that you're looking at an airport versus just an open field is look for an area of ground that is a slightly different color than the surrounding area or has maybe a little bit of an outline around it. This is a small private field in kind of central Arkansas here, and you can see it's kind of got this green strip going down the middle, and that is where the runway is, and it's got a little bit of an outline around it to show us kind of where the actual landing surface is. Another thing you can look for is look for an area that has a slightly different colored area in the middle of it. This is a private field over in western Arkansas, and you can see it kind of has a little bit of a brown kind of strip going down the middle of it, and that's not uncommon on unpaved fields to be able to see those both in flight sim and the real world. Also looks like it's got some rows of hedges to mark kind of where the landing surface is there as well. More often than not, you're looking for an area that's shaped like a very thin rectangle versus the big wide rectangles that you see in with open fields or natural fields. So you can see kind of the outline of that thin rectangle here, and you can see it on the previous airport here. It's got a little bit of a rectangle shape to it. And then the open fields are going to be wider, and they're going to be a little bit bigger than our unpaved airports. One trick you can use in Flight Simulator to find airports that is a technique that you can't use in the real world is to place yourself on the runway of the unpaved airport you want to use using the world map. Then either use SLU or use the drone camera to get in the air and see what both the airport and the local landmarks look like from the direction that you'll be approaching the airport from. You can also take a look at the detailed satellite images and the runway orientation and layout in the world map to get a lay of the land. Kind of a common example of this is Schertz Airport in California. The identifier there is Oscar 77, and this is like number 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or something, I think, on the Yosemite bush trip. You fly into this airport, and a lot of people do it incorrectly, including myself the first time. They'll land on this strip right here. Looks like a runway, looks like you should be able to land there, but if you look at the actual world map, the actual runway runs east and west. So this is the runway right here. And if you land on this runway and stop on this runway, you won't get credit for that leg. It won't tell you that you're done with the leg. And you're going, well, it looked like the airport. Where am I? You see the buildings that are, on the little picture in the bush strip, and you're not sure why it's not discontinuing. But it's because you need to land on this east-west runway. And if you go to the world map and you put in Schertz Airport and you zoom in on it, you see the picture that you see in the bush strip with the buildings, the red roof buildings at the north end there, but then you see that the actual runway is running east-west there. And then if you click fly, then you will pop to the end of the runway and you can see exactly what it's supposed to look like, what your landing site's going to look like. And again, you get up in the air either using SLU or using your drone camera and take a look around. There's your landmark red roof buildings over there, and you can see where the runway is that you're supposed to be landing on that leg. So anytime you're having trouble finding an airport on a bush trip, you can't actually do this in the bush trip. You have to discontinue the bush trip and enter the airport that you're having trouble finding. But once you do that, you'll be right at that airport, and then you can take a look around, and it should be a lot easier to find once you know some landmarks and orientation as far as what you're looking for and what you're looking to land on. In the real world, you should use soft field procedures when taxiing as well. Soft field taxi procedure is to hold the yoke or stick full aft or full elevator up during the taxi in a nose wheel airplane. This helps to keep the weight of the airplane off the nose wheel and helps to prevent the nose wheel from digging into the soft surface and slowing or stopping the airplane. It also gives the propeller a little extra clearance from the surface, helping to reduce the chance of getting prop damage from things like loose rocks or other debris. I don't think either of those things is going to happen in flight sim, so whether or not you use that technique in flight sim is up to you and how much realism you want in your flight sim flying techniques. What you will notice in flight sim on soft fields is the aircraft will accelerate a lot slower on soft surfaces and require a little more power to get going and to keep it moving during taxi. In the real world, it's recommended that you plan your taxi on soft surfaces so that you don't have to stop if at all possible, particularly as you transition into your takeoff roll from your taxi. You want to keep it moving because if it gets stopped, the aircraft will be hard to get moving again. So as far as our training locations go today, we're going to start out at Hilversum Airport in the Netherlands. The identifier on that one is Echo Hotel Hotel Victor. It's a field that's located about 16 miles east-southeast of Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport, and it has several nice, long, wide grass runways we can use to practice our soft field procedures initially. After we get a hang of the basic procedures, we'll move out to 4 Mile Creek Ranch Airport, a private field in central Arkansas. The identifier on that one is 3 Alpha Romeo 4. And there we will learn to combine our soft and short field procedures, since many unpaved runways are also on the shorter side and come with obstacles. After that, we'll take a look at off-airport takeoffs and landings and some of the considerations you need to think about if you want to try to do some of those. So let's take a look at what we'll call the normal soft field procedure, and this is a procedure that you want to use if your runway is at least 2,000 feet long and you don't have any obstructions at the departure end of the runway. All right, so for this procedure, we want to be at flaps 10 for the takeoff. Again, with a normal takeoff without a soft or short field, you can be at flaps 0 or 10. But to get book performance from a short field or a soft field, or from both, you need flaps 10. Make sure your before takeoff checklist is complete. And on a soft surface, at least in the real world, you want to try to keep the aircraft rolling, and if at all possible, try not to stop, particularly as you pull into position for a takeoff. Then once you're facing down the runway, apply your takeoff power, full power in the 152. And then in the real world, in a real airplane, you would actually be holding your elevator full aft. But I found in Flight Simulator, if you do that, the nose will pop out very aggressively and strike the tail. So I find that it's better in Flight Simulator to provide a slight aft back pressure to the stick. Uh, if you're using a joystick, probably about a quarter deflection towards the back or maybe a half deflection from neutral seems to work out pretty well. And as you're rolling down the runway, you want to keep that slight elevator pressure applied until the nose wheel lifts off the surface. Again, it will try to pop up rather aggressively, so once it starts to come up on you, you want to release a little bit of the back pressure. And what you're trying to do is maintain about 5 degrees of pitch until the aircraft comes off the runway. And it is going to be a little squirrely. It's going to be bobbing on you a little bit. That's normal for Flight Simulator. Just do the best that you can to make small corrections and keep it at about 5 degrees of pitch. And just hold it there until the aircraft is ready to fly, and let the aircraft come off the runway when it is ready to fly. Once it's airborne, we don't have enough speed to climb out yet. We're still in ground effect, and if we try to climb at their speed, it's not going to work very well. It's going to be at a very slow speed, probably 30, 40 knots when the airplane becomes airborne. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually pitch down a little bit, about a nose level attitude or so, and then we're going to fly level in ground effect. We're going to fly just right above the ground, no more than about 15 feet above the ground, a little closer if we can. And we'll talk a bit more about what ground effect is, but we're going to keep it down there real close to the runway and just fly level right above the runway and allow the aircraft to accelerate to VY since we don't have an obstacle. Once we've hit VY, once we've hit 70 knots, then we'll go ahead and pitch back up to about 10 degrees or so, and then pitch to maintain 70 knots and climb on out. And then once we've got the climb going, we'll retract the flaps. You'll notice we're not retracting the flaps as we come through 60 on this maneuver, because when you retract the flaps, it is going to have a little bit of a tendency to nose down a little bit. And since we're right above the runway, we don't want to nose into the ground. So we're going to wait until we started that climb to go ahead and retract the flaps. After that, it just becomes a normal takeoff. So we're going to climb at 70 knots. And then at 1,000 feet, if you're leaving the area, you can turn your lights off and then accomplish your after takeoff checklist. So let's talk a little bit more about what ground effect is. So what is ground effect? Well, ground effect is a phenomena that occurs when you're half a wingspan length from the ground or so. So in a 152, our wingspan is about 33 feet. So 16 and a half feet from the ground, we're going to be in ground effect. And ground effect is a change in the airflow pattern over the airplane due to the closeness to the ground that results in the aircraft having quite a bit less drag than it would if it's out of ground effect. You can see this when you're landing. It's the reason that you tend to float down the runway quite a ways when you're landing. The aircraft has lost a lot of its drag and has become much more efficient because of that change in the airflow, and so it tends to float rather than slowing down quickly. We can take advantage of this in a soft field procedure by getting the aircraft off the ground at a much lower speed than it would normally fly. It'll come off the ground at 30 or 40 knots, and obviously we can't climb out of ground effect in this at this speed, because once it gets that drag back, once it's above ground effect, the airplane is going to stall and come right back down to the ground. So what we do is we keep it in ground effect and we get it out of the soft surface that is slowing us down and creating drag on the wheels, and then get it up above that surface and allow it to accelerate to a normal speed, and then we pitch up and climb out. All right, so to set up for this first demo, we will work left to right from our world map, just like we usually do. Aircraft selection, we want the Textron Aviation Cessna 152. The weight and balance, we are going to go ahead and put two full full tanks of gas in there, and we'll stick with our two 170-pound occupants, and that gets us fairly close to max gross weight there. As far as the airport, we'll go ahead and go into search, and we'll do Echo Hotel Hotel Victor, which is the Hilversum Airport, and we'll use runway 25, although it won't put us quite right on the runway. We're going to need to adjust that once we get into the flight. All that looks good. And then as far as the time, we'll go ahead and set it up for noon, and we'll make it a June day to get the maximum lighting. So June 20th or so should work out pretty well. We'll adjust the weather when we get into the actual flight. All right, so we're ready to go fly. We'll go ahead and click fly, and then we'll make a few last minute adjustments once we're in the flight. All right, so we've spawned into the flight, and if you look at the flight from kind of an aerial view here, which I have with the drone camera, you'll notice that it's got runway 25 kind of marked with these little chalk marks on the grass. At least I think that's what they are. So it's marked fairly well, but the Flight Simulator puts you over here. So we are going to, you can either taxi over here, although I will say it is difficult to see any of this from the ground, or you can also slew yourself over there. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get out of the drone camera view and go into the slew view. You do need to get up fairly high to be able to see the runway markings here, but you can see them under the cowling there, or under the wings there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set us down by these, looks like a set of 4 marks on each side, and set us down right about there to begin the takeoff run here. All right, so with that done, and I can see the little marks kind of over here on each side there, and that's where I want to start my takeoff roll. And the one other thing we want to set before we get going here is we'll go in and set the weather. I'm going to take out the wind. Again, I like to, when I'm starting out learning a new maneuver, I want to do it as easy as possible, so we'll take out any sort of crosswind in there. Let's see if the time is correct. Looks like it did translate that, and then we'll go ahead and bump the temperature up to something a little more realistic for a June day. We'll put it up about 25 degrees C. So that gets us all set up for our first takeoff, and let's go ahead and do a demo of a soft field takeoff. All right, so my before takeoff checklist is complete. My flaps are set to 10. My parking brake is released. I'm going to put just a little bit of back pressure in here before we get the takeoff roll started, and then I'm going to go and apply takeoff power. And I'm just going to keep that back pressure in there until the nose starts to come off the ground just a little bit. It's usually about the time the airspeed comes alive is when that happens, and so once that happens, I'm going to try to pitch for about 5 degrees. Then the aircraft becomes airborne. I'm just going to nose it over to level flight and accelerate in ground effect to 70 knots. There's 70, so I'll go ahead and pitch up to that 10 degrees and hold that 70 knots with the 10 degrees. We're climbing, we're clear of all obstacles, so we'll retract the flaps. It's going to nose over just a little bit on me, so again, I'm just going to hold the pitch or maintain the pitch I need for that 70 knots. And after that, it just becomes a normal takeoff. We'll climb up to 1,000 feet. We'll do our after takeoff checklist, and then we're just going to do a left pattern back around for a soft field landing on the same runway. So after you take off, just fly a normal pattern back around to set up for a landing on runway 25, the runway that we just took off from. And the approach is going to be a normal approach basically until we cross the threshold. So you want to fly your normal approach at 60 knots. Make sure that that you accomplish your before landing checklist when you're on final. And then where things change is as you come over the threshold of the runway. So as you come over the threshold of the runway, we're going to reduce power at a slightly slower rate as we cross the runway threshold. What we're trying to do is we're trying to minimize the sink rate. We want to touch down at as low a sink rate as possible. And we can even, as we're sinking down onto the runway, we can actually add just a little bit of power right before touchdown to kind of cushion the landing. You don't have to do that, but it is a technique that's a lot of people use, and it is an acceptable technique. So try to touch down at a minimum sink rate and a slow speed as possible. Flare so that you get your main wheels touching down first. You do want to try to hold it off the runway as long as you can and get the flare up, probably up close to 10 degrees to make sure those main wheels touch down first. Once the mains are down, use elevator back pressure to keep the nose wheel off the ground. And then as you're rolling out, you're going to gradually increase that elevator back pressure to hold the nose off the runway as long as possible. Eventually the nose is going to fall to the runway. You're just going to run out of elevator authority to keep it up, but go ahead and increase your elevator back pressure to full aft. That'll both help keep the load off the tires and it will help the aircraft to slow down. And then the last thing is to minimize the use of wheel brakes. In the real world, when you're landing on a soft surface, it's got enough friction that the friction of the grass will actually probably bring you to stop without using wheel brakes. And if you use wheel brakes on a very soft surface, sometimes the tires will dig in, and that causes a risk for the airplane to nose over. In Flight Simulator, the friction of the soft surfaces is not that much, not as much as it is in real life, so you probably are going to have to use a little bit of wheel braking to get the airplane stopped, but just a couple of taps should probably do it. Just squeeze them for about a second, let go, and if it's still not coming to stop, give it another tap to try to get it stopped. All right, so let's take a look at how to do one of these. All right, so I'm coming through about 500 feet here on my short final. And again, I'm just flying a normal approach here at a normal airspeed, trying to target that 300 to 400 foot per minute descent. And the 4 landing checklist is complete, just like any other approach. I've got it trimmed out to fly my approach speed. And everything is going to be a normal approach until we get over the threshold. So I'm starting to pick out those chart marks that indicate the end of the threshold there. So once it's time to settle in for that landing, I'm just going to reduce the power a little more slowly. I'm going to try to minimize that sink rate. So it looks like I've got the field made. I'm going to go ahead and bring the power, ease it on back. I'm going to do basically a normal round down here, and then I really want to hold the aircraft off. I want it to be as slow as it possibly can and have that pitch up about 10 degrees when I touch down. There we go. I'm going to keep that back pressure, try to keep that nose wheel off as long as I can. The tail won't fly the nose anymore. So now I've gone to full back pressure, and then I'll use brakes as necessary to stop before the end of the field. Again, in real life, you probably wouldn't even need brakes. The grass would probably slow you down. But in Flight Sim, you're going to need just a little bit of brakes. So there you have a normal soft field landing. So you'll find when you're doing a soft field takeoff from a short soft field, it's going to look like kind of a hybrid approach or a hybrid takeoff. It's going to look a little bit like a soft field takeoff on the first half of the takeoff and a little bit like a short field takeoff on the back half of the takeoff. Just like all of our other short and soft field work, we want the flaps set to 10 degrees. Before you take the runway, make sure your before takeoff checklist is complete. Just like with a normal soft field takeoff, you want to try to keep it rolling if possible. Try not to stop if you can. Again, in Flight Simulator, not a big deal if you do, and a lot of times the sim is going to drop you on the runway if you start on the runway, but if possible, try to keep it rolling. Go ahead and apply takeoff power, full power on the 152 once you've taken the runway. One thing that is a little different than a short field takeoff on a hard surface runway is that we don't need to hold the brakes to run up the engine. We're not going to give that much more performance by doing that because of the drag of the surface on the wheels. It's going to kind of cancel each other out, so you really don't need to hold the brakes and run up the engine and then release them. Go ahead and apply that slight aft up elevator back pressure to take the weight of the aircraft off of the nose wheel. Then we'll keep that slight elevator back pressure applied until the nose wheel lifts off the surface. Once it comes off, again, try to maintain about 5 degrees of pitch. It's not going to be easy. It's probably going to try to bob on you until you get a feel for how it reacts. But once you've got that 5 degrees pitch, just hold that 5 degrees pitch until the aircraft lifts off the runway. Once it's airborne, this is where things change just a little bit. Go ahead and fly level and ground effect, just like we did with the normal soft field takeoff, but this time we're going to accelerate just to 54 knots. So you'll probably lift off at 35, 40 knots. You've only got about 15 knots to gain, 15 to 20 knots to gain before you're at VX. Once you're at VX or 54 knots, go ahead and pitch up pretty aggressively, just like you did with the rotation for the short field takeoff, and then pitch to maintain that 54 knots. And you're going to hold that 54 knots until you've cleared all of the obstacles. Once you're clear of the obstacles, you'll go ahead and reduce the back pressure and allow the aircraft to accelerate to VY or 70 knots. And then once you're passing through 60 knots, you can go ahead and retract the flaps. After that, it becomes a normal takeoff again. Once you get to 1,000 feet, you can do your lights as you want and then accomplish your after takeoff checklist. So let's take a look at a demonstration of this maneuver. All right, so here we are at on runway 27, and I've corrected the weather so that we have no wind, and we have 25 degrees C on the temperature. Parking brake is released, flaps are set to 10 before takeoff checklist is complete. I'll put in just a little bit of elevator back pressure here, and we'll go ahead and apply takeoff power and see how we do on a soft field that is also relatively short. Again, once the airspeed starts to come alive is about the time that the nose is going to pop off the ground. There it goes. I'm going to try to hold about 5 degrees or so. Aircraft comes off the ground. I'll nose over to keep it in ground effect. Looking for 54 knots. There's 54, so I'll pitch up to about 10 degrees. Hold 54 knots until we've cleared our obstacles there. Obstacles are clear, so go ahead and release the back pressure a little bit, let it start accelerating. 60 knots, I'll go ahead and bring those flaps up. Now I'm just going to pitch for 70 knots, best rate of climb, VY. And then it becomes just another normal takeoff after that. So we'll climb on up to 1,000 feet. And we'll do our after takeoff checklist, and then we'll do a normal left-hand traffic pattern background and set up for a short field landing on our short soft field on runway 27. So you'll see with the short field landing to or soft field landing to a short runway, it's going to be kind of the mirror of the soft field takeoff on a short field, and that the first half of the procedure is going to look like short field procedures and the back half is going to look like soft field procedures. So up until about 500 feet AGL, we're going to just be flying a normal approach, 60 knots, flaps 30, and just adjusting our pitch and power to maintain a glide path and a path that clears the obstacles on the runway so that our aiming point is just beyond that obstacle. And we're going to fly that at 60 knots initially, but at about 500 feet, 7 to 500 feet, and a little higher if you're just starting out. Transition to flying that 54 knots. So adjust your pitch and power to fly 54 knots. Fly that all the way until your obstacle is cleared. And once your obstacle is cleared, or you're certain that you're going to clear the obstacle, go ahead and reduce the power to idle. The nose will come down, go ahead and let it, and then pitch to maintain that 54 knots at that idle power setting. Again, resist the urge to try to push the nose over to try to get an earlier touchdown. That will just cause your airspeed to go up and cause you to float once you get down onto the runway. As we're coming down and sinking down towards the runway, again, we want to minimize the sink rate since we are still going for a soft field here. You may need to add a little bit of power to cushion the touchdown since we're coming down at a pretty good rate once we pull that power to idle. So maybe a couple hundred RPMs if you've got a pretty good sink rate going on. Just goose that in for a second or two, and that should be enough to kind of cushion the touchdown. And then flare so that the main wheels touch down first. Again, you want about a 10-degree pitch up when you touch down to make sure those mains are on and the nose wheel is off. And then use elevator back pressure to keep that nose wheel off the ground once you're down. On the rollout, again, we're transitioning to more of a soft field type technique here. You're going to hold the nose off the runway as long as you can, gradually increasing the elevator back pressure to full aft and up. Eventually that nose wheel will come to the ground, and just maintain that full aft elevator to keep the weight off the nose wheel and to get yourself slowed down. Minimize the use of wheel brakes if at all possible, but you are on a short field, so getting the aircraft stopped is preferable to hitting the trees. And in Flight Simulator, you're not likely to nose over even on a soft field. It doesn't really seem to do anything when it's raining. There's not like an increased softness to the field, if you will. So you can usually go ahead and hammer the brakes down even on a soft field if you're rushing up on the trees and get it air stopped without risking the airplane flipping over. All right, so I'm coming through 500 feet AGL. The before landing checklist is complete, and I've got myself at 54 knots at a descent rate that should put me down just beyond those trees there. And then as we clear the trees, we'll bring the power to idle, and then try to get a nice, good soft field landing on a short field, and then get it down and get it stopped. Looks like I'm a little high here, so I'm going to adjust the power just a little bit. Just a smidge fast. Alright, so it looks like we've got the trees cleared, so I'm going to pull the power to idle. Nose is going to drop. I'll let it. I'm just going to pitch to maintain that 54 knots. And then here I can use a little power in the flare if I need to, but I just want to get that nose up and get it down on the mains. Once it's down, I want to hold that nose wheel off until it won't fly anymore. And then once the nose wheel's on there, full aft elevator pressure, and then brakes as needed to bring the airplane to a stop. Again, on Flight Simulator, it's probably not going to nose over on you on a soft field. Real life, you need to be careful about that, but in real life, you'd also get more friction from the grass. So there's a soft field landing on a field that is both a soft surface and not is a short length. One last thing we'll talk about is landing and taking off somewhere other than an airport. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, it's possible to land your aircraft in pretty much any area in Flight Simulator that's relatively open, flat, level, and is long enough for you to take off and land on. Most of the open farm type fields in Flight Simulator have a nice consistent grass turf that's not really that much different from what you'd find on actual grass airports or runways in Flight Simulator. Though if it's a brown field, those are going to look more like dirt when you're on the ground, but it's still going to be a nice level surface for you. So here are a few tips for having a successful off-airport landing if you'd like to try landing off-airport in Flight Simulator. First of all, select a field that is long enough for you to take off and land, and be aware that you are probably going to overestimate the field's length. You're going to think it's longer than it actually is. And we'll talk about a way to deal with that here in just a second. Make sure that the area is relatively open and that there are no trees or other obstacles that are going to interfere with your takeoff run or your landing roll. Make sure that the area is relatively flat. For the most part, farm fields are going to work the best. Nice, flat, open farm fields. If you want to try to attempt to land on an area that has a bit of a slope to it, it's best to land uphill and then take off downhill. But just be careful if you land on a hill that has a very steep slope. The aircraft may begin to roll backwards once it's completed its landing roll, and that's a bad place to be in because as you start to roll backwards, if you put on the brakes, your momentum is going towards the tail, so when the tires stop suddenly or try to, you're going to rock back onto your tail and probably not stop going backwards down the hill. And probably will result in some sort of damage that will end the flight simulator session. It's also a good idea to make a low pass over an area that you want to land on. A lot of times what it looks like from the air is going to be quite a bit different than what it looks like when you're, on a short final. So if you go down and pass above the area at like 100 feet or something like that, it'll give you a good idea of how long the area is, if there's any obstacles there, what the slope is like, all that sort of stuff. This is a good practice in the real world as well. It gives you a chance to kind of inspect the area for all those things that we mentioned. And in the real world, you're actually looking for things like, rocks and gopher holes and things like that. Fortunately, in Flight Simulator, all the fields are nice and pristine and don't have any rocks or critter holes that you have to worry about. Once you've settled on a field that you'd like to try to land in or take off from, just use your best soft and or short field technique as applicable, and you should be able to get in and out just fine. One last question that might be on your mind is, in the real world, is this legal? Well, it's a bit of a legal gray area. There are no aviation regulations that prohibit pilots from landing someplace that isn't a designated airport. But if it's private property, it's still considered trespassing, just like if you drove your car onto it. Also, insurance companies may not insure you if you have an accident or incident if you land someplace that's not a designated airport. So a smart pilot in the real world will do quite a bit of homework before they attempt an off-airport landing in a non-emergency situation. But in Flight Simulator, any area you think you can land on is fair game, so go for it. So that finishes up this video. Hopefully it's given you the confidence you need to try landings on all those unpaved surfaces that are out there in Flight Simulator. As always, if you've enjoyed the content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.